Why do so few people try and overthrow the systems that oppress and exploit us? Why don't more workers go on strike for higher wages and better conditions? How can some women vote for openly sexist politicians or black and brown people for racists? I'm Jacob Mukherjee and I teach political communications. In this video, I'm going to talk about a concept which will hopefully help us answer some of those questions. And that concept is hegemony. Now let's first look at the basics of what that word means. Before the 20th century, the word hegemony was generally used to mean dominance, specifically military dominance, and the word is sometimes still used that way today. But from the mid-20th century onwards, a new meaning of the term developed. Rather than referring to direct physical domination like the military rule of one country over another, today the word hegemony is often used to refer to a form of power based on consent. The person most responsible for this change in the meaning of the word hegemony is the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, who wrote his most insightful words from inside a fascist jail cell in the 1920s and 30s. Gramsci used hegemony to describe not direct repression or force, but rather leadership. That is, to describe a situation where a powerful class or group rules with the consent of those they rule over. Part of the reason that Gramsci developed his ideas on hegemony was because he wanted to solve a mystery, which was, why was there a successful revolution against capitalism in Russia in 1917, but not in Germany or Britain or other Western European countries? Why was this a mystery? Well, up to that point, Marxists like Gramsci had expected the revolution to happen first in countries where capitalism was fully developed and where there was a large enough industrial working class to get organised and overthrow the capitalist system. But Russia in 1917 was still a mostly rural society, and the urban working class was quite small, much smaller than, say, in Britain. Also, Russia was quite a violent and repressive regime, so it was harder for opponents of the state to organise resistance than in countries where there were some democratic freedoms, like France or Britain at the time. Why then did Russian revolutionaries succeed, where, for example, German revolutionaries failed? To put it simply, it was precisely because the Russian regime ruled mostly through coercion, that is, through violence, force and fear, that made it particularly vulnerable to being overthrown. You see, force is only effective if you have the people willing to fire the bullets to carry out the repression. So when the Russian army and police stopped defending the government, the whole regime crumbled, and the Russian revolutionaries were able to take over easily. By contrast, Gramsci said, in the West, that is in Western Europe, the state didn't rule only through force. Rather, in countries like early 20th century Britain, there was a degree of consent for the power of the capitalist ruling class. In other words, the population, or at least much of it, accepted their rule. Now this consent made the capitalist order in Western European countries much stronger and more stable than in Russia. So, the simplest definition of hegemony is a form of power or rule based on consent, which Gramsci argued is a far more secure and stable form of power than that based on force alone. But hang on, consent? Why would the working class consent to its own oppression? Remember, Gramsci was a Marxist who saw capitalism as an inherently exploitative system where the overwhelming majority had to spend their lives working so that a tiny elite could enjoy fabulous riches. Why would people accept that? How exactly does hegemony work? Well, let's look at the details. Remember I said that Gramsci used hegemony to mean a form of leadership? Well, the way the ruling class leads is by using its control and influence over things like the media and the education system to impose upon the whole of society a worldview, a morality, a way of seeing ourselves and one another that supports the capitalist system and the rule of the rich, the bourgeoisie. Now, we're not only talking about blatant propaganda here, things like the media telling us that workers going on strike for higher wages are selfish enemies of the public. That kind of propaganda does exist and it is important, but hegemony also works on a much more subtle level. And in fact, this is the level on which it's most effective. Our most basic assumptions about the world that we consider to be natural, non-political, and common sense are also a product of ruling class hegemony. Take the idea that we're entitled to do more or less whatever we like with our money, because whether we got it from wages or investments, we've earned it. Most people wouldn't even regard that idea as political. They'd see it as obvious, as self-evident, as mere common sense. But that assumption is also false, because if you think about it, an individual on her own can't create any wealth. Indeed, all wealth is ultimately produced collectively, by society. Although it's false, that assumption is very useful for capitalism and capitalists, because if the public thinks that individuals deserve all of their wealth, that makes it really difficult for governments to justify taking any of that wealth through things like high taxes on the wealthy. We can also think about the often unspoken assumptions that shape the way we think and act about gender and sexuality and much else besides, and the way that these norms support the power of, for example, men over women. So we can apply the idea of hegemony to look at power in all kinds of contexts, not solely in terms of the power of one class over another. But the point is, because our most basic assumptions are shaped by the powerful, we often struggle even to imagine alternatives to the status quo, or at least to find a language to articulate them in. And that means that even when we're unhappy with being exploited, which of course we often are, outright active opposition to the system as a whole is rare. And what we tend to see instead is a form of passive and often reluctant acceptance. Indeed, it might be more accurate to define hegemony as a form of power based on popular acceptance of, rather than consent to, elite rule. Now, it's important to say that the idea of hegemony is not like some conspiracy theory where the ruling class can get us to believe whatever it wants in order to maintain its power. Hegemonic ideas can only be hegemonic if they're plausible, if they resonate to some degree with people's experiences. So the elite can't, for example, convince us that we're all going to be rich and successful by next month, at a time when people are struggling even to heat their homes or put food on their tables. Hegemony is not about an all-powerful ruling class manipulating all our thoughts to keep us in our place. There's no guarantee that attempts to establish or maintain hegemony will be successful. And no group and no system is hegemonic forever. Instead, for Gramsci, groups can only establish and sustain hegemony successfully if they're able to respond to events and explain reality with a convincing narrative that helps them win and maintain power. A good example of this is the way politicians like Margaret Thatcher blamed the social and economic crises of the 1970s on greedy trade unions, rebellious minorities, and a loss of national pride, in a narrative that allowed her to win power and implement her agenda of selling off public assets, cutting the welfare state, and attacking workers' rights. So, to win and maintain hegemony, groups have to be strategic and opportunistic, and, importantly, all this means that the working class and other groups that are currently oppressed and exploited can one day hope to achieve hegemony themselves. How? Well, through what Gramsci called a war of position, which means working slowly and carefully to create new ideas, new ways of doing things, new cultures that can challenge the hegemony of the ruling class and, when the time is right, overthrow that class and establish a new system and a new hegemony. Finally, an important clarification. Hegemony is often spoken about as if it's solely a question of ideas and assumptions that support the status quo. That is a vital part of the story, but there's more to it than that. Because not only does the ruling class try to shape the way we see society, they also shape the way we live our lives. Hegemony is not just about ways of thinking, but about ways of being as well. We are not only told, for example, that competition is good, we are made to compete with one another, whether we like it or not. We're not only persuaded that individuals should take responsibility for themselves, we are made to take responsibility for ourselves as individuals, whether we want to or not. How does this happen, and why is it important? Well, I explain some of that in an upcoming video on the word work. I hope you'll join me for that. I also hope you found this video useful. Do share it if you have. I will see you next time. Bye bye for now.